work out why we do what we do. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
This week on the podcast Spark and Fire, comedian Cristela Alonzo.
I couldn't get auditions. A voice teacher told me, well, as a Latina, you can do West Side Story and then you're done.
Cristela shares the story of being the first Latina to write, produce, and star in a primetime comedy. On Spark and Fire, creators share their stories to fuel your creativity. Spark and Fire is a Wait What original in partnership with the BBC. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts.
Thanks for downloading this edition of The Y Factor from the BBC. My name's Catherine Carr. This is the programme that tries to understand why we do the things we do. And in this edition, I'm finding out all about job interviews.
Welcome to your interview. We're using this video interview to give you the opportunity to express who you are. You'll be asked one or more questions. A countdown will tell
In the
you how long
future,
you have to
if you're lucky enough to have a job that hasn't been replaced by artificial intelligence, you may well find that AI is used to interview you for one.
So this is a quick and easy process, but keep an eye on the countdown as you have a limited time to answer. And finally, and most importantly, make sure that you're sitting comfortably and relax.
Or your next interview may be completely out of the box and out of the office.
When you're driving together, if you're on a long stretch of road, when you sit with someone for 4 or 5 hours, at the tail end of 4 or 5 hours, you know whether you want to see them again.
Or perhaps telling the right joke might get you the job.
Why couldn't the bicycle stand up? Because it was too tired.
This is the BBC World Service. I'm Catherine Carr, and in this edition of The Y Factor, why has the traditional interview survived so long, and why is so much value placed on it?
So, have a look in the mirror. What do you think, Prim?
I think this
happy
is
with
fabulous,
that?
yes.
You look lovely.
Yes.
And the top goes really well. The neckline's really
Thank
nice
you so
with the
much.
jacket.
It's really nice, the coordination.
To find out what candidates can do to prepare for an interview, I visited a UK charity called SmartWorks. It helps women get back into work. They offer interview prep and help you nail that first impression by offering free interview outfits. As a professional recruitment consultant, Jessica Large has clear ideas about how to ace the interview.
Generally, it's focus that people need and clarity around what's expected from them in terms of answering questions. You know, it's all the usual things you would expect. It's a firm handshake, it's good eye contact, it's about posture, it's about tone, it's about mannerisms, and just being aware of those things.
To remind myself what an interview feels like, Jessica put me through my paces, and I clearly hadn't prepared.
Was there a situation where you did fail in? Can you give me an example of where you felt you failed?
I can't remember a big one. I can remember the first thing I ever recorded. I went and recorded this person. A whole industry has mushroomed up around interviews, from one-to-one tutorials, webinars, books and courses, all offering tons of advice. But it may largely be a total waste of time.
My name is Frank Ranieri, and I'm a professor of psychology here at Oregon State University. The interview is essentially a microcosm of all interpersonal behavior. And one of the things that's been established is that first impressions are really very important.
In fact, they may be all that matters.
We videotaped fairly long interviews. We just took snippets of the meetings and greetings before the interview took place, basically just a handshake. And we showed these 10-second long clips of people introducing themselves to the interviewers, and we just asked people to evaluate them as if they were evaluating an applicant for a job interview. And we found that the evaluations made by untrained individuals of that 10-second greeting predicted the outcome of the interview process. We call it a halo effect. Okay, so if you get an immediate liking for someone, then every ambiguous bit of information you have will be perceived in that favorable light. If you dislike someone, then even neutral behavior will be perceived negatively.
So the whole half an hour after the first 10 seconds was almost obsolete.
Exactly.
What are you most proud of?
I've set up a podcast, more or less from nothing, which we've built into a brand.
I'm Ute Christine Kleer. I'm a professor of work and organizational psychology at the University of Gießen in Germany. Informal ways of interviewing, if you want, that's the classic way we run selection interviews, is highly unstructured. You ask candidates whatever you think might be relevant, whatever comes to your mind at that point. And quite often we don't have a clear evaluation standard as to what it is that we're looking for. And this is really problematic, both for candidates in terms of fairness and for organizations. These classic informal interviews, they don't predict performance very well. Questions which are, I would say, part of nearly every interview, something like, well, tell me something about yourself. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Where do you see yourself in 5 years and 10 years? Why are you applying with us specifically?
So, unstructured, free-flowing interviews are very common, and they may seem creative and intuitive to the person carrying them out. But actually, all the results show that they're pretty flawed as a way of selecting the best employees.
There's a beautiful study done at the City in London with investment bankers, and they looked at interviews run with male applicants and with female applicants. And female applicants got asked questions that nobody ever thought of asking the male applicants, just because the female applicants didn't fit into the stereotypical profile of this job. Like, do you think you're tough enough for this job? Are you really ambitious enough for this job? How will you handle family and work? These type of things.
To avoid falling into this trap, top firms like Google are much keener on more structured interviews, where all candidates are asked a set of predetermined questions. Laszlo Bock was Senior Vice President of People Operations there for a decade. His interview technique seems a far cry from the groovy table football image Google projects.
The best way in an interview to assess almost any attribute is both simple and boring. The best way to assess candidates is by using something called structured interview questions. And a structured interview question has a couple elements to it. One is you decide what you're going to be interviewing for, what attributes, and most organizations unfortunately don't do that. But you identify ahead of time what you're going to be interviewing for. The second thing you then do is you ask pretty simple historic questions. Give me an example of a time when you demonstrated this or that skill. Tell me about a time you solved an analytically difficult problem. Tell me about a leadership challenge you had. Tell me about how you work with teams. Tell me what your colleagues have said about you or would say about you.
Clearly you have to fit in and out of teams. Do you ever have to take a leadership role within that? Can you give me an example where you've had to do that?
If I produce a programme, I would have to. With a new project I'm doing as a freelancer, I've had to manage some interns.
Yeah.
I find that really difficult. While all the emphasis is on how the interviewee should prepare for their interview ordeal, maybe there's a case for interviewers doing more research, especially when they're in a position of recruiting people from different cultures. Erin Meyer is the author of a book called The Culture Map.
The way we are taught to think actually differs from one country to another, and that impacts the type of interview questions that we would ask. In the U.S., in our schooling system, we have a very strong focus on practical learning, and therefore in an interview, we also are taught on situational interviewing techniques. Tell me about a time that you failed. In comparison, in France or in other Latin countries, there's a strong focus on concepts and principles. And therefore, in interviews, people are much more likely to ask theoretical questions, like, tell me what your beliefs are as a leader. Then what happens when we have, let's say, Americans and French people interviewing one another is that the American will say, tell me about a time that you failed. And the French person will respond by saying, let me talk with you about my beliefs as to how to avoid failure, which leads the American to feel that the person is, of course, avoiding the question.
So it seems to me that the way that Americans, and to a lesser extent Brits, approach interviews as a result of their educational system, it's a much more kind of selling yourself approach to going for a job.
Yeah, well, I think that's another element that's very interesting. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Tokyo working with an American company who's installed there, and I was working with a Japanese woman who's responsible for hiring the Japanese employees of this American company. And it's very interesting because in Japan, the culture is set up so that people should not brag. People know what your strengths are. There's no need to tell them. And if someone is telling you how great they are, it's really a sign of immaturity. And this is where we have to be very careful when we are assessing international candidates' effectiveness, because of course we use our own cultural lens to determine whether someone seems like they'd be a good colleague or seems intelligent, when actually it's critical that we rely on people from that culture to help us understand who will be effective. International companies do this all the time. Let me give you an example. You have a British company and they're hiring people in Indonesia. So they find some good candidates. The British manager goes down to Indonesia. The person comes into the interview and the British person asks the question and the Indonesian person sits quietly. The British person feels really uncomfortable. He thinks, oh, this person is very shy. She doesn't have much to say. He answers the question himself. If he recognized that in Indonesia there's a lot more silence that's built into the discussion and that it shows respect to think for several seconds or even a minute before giving a response, then he may have adjusted his own style to allow the person to speak comfortably and then would have left having an entirely different impression of what that candidate was like. What I find is that around the world, in most multinational companies, people just go in, they judge the person from their own lens, and then they end up hiring people who are most like them instead of the people who would be most effective in that country.
Notwithstanding cultural pitfalls, advances in technology mean any recruiter in any country can minimise the challenges of bias with an ultra-standardised interview in which flesh and blood humans barely feature.
It's a bit of software that helps employers with the problems they face when they are recruiting a high volume of candidates. Part of what we do is provide a way to assess candidates, and that assessment can be through online tests or it could be through recorded video interviews.
Will Hamilton is the founder of a company called Launchpad Recruits.
It's not replacing a face-to-face interview. It's there to replace a telephone interview. And so you could have a video something like this.
Welcome to your interview. We're using this video interview to give you the opportunity to express who you are. You'll be asked one or more questions. A countdown will tell you how long you have to think about your answer. Your answer will then be recorded. You'll be able to do a practice question to see how it works before you start for real. It couldn't be simpler. So this is a quick and easy process, but keep an eye on the countdown as you have a limited time to answer. And finally,
candidates are walked through an interview remotely using their home computer, reading questions on the screen before videoing and saving their answers. The interview experience is virtually identical for everyone, and it's particularly useful for filling lots of similar roles at once. It's been used in roles as varied as shelf stacking at supermarkets to graduate jobs.
We've just connected here. They give access to their webcam, and now they can see themselves.
Oh,
so they confirm. I can see me.
I think I would find that off-putting. I find that very hard on FaceTime anyway.
Higher quality video will make you look better and appear more professional. Check what's in the shop behind you. Get rid of the posters and the unmade bed. A plain wall is the best option.
We're not obeying any of your tips because we're in a filthy, messy cubbyhole at the BBC with all sorts of things around.
Resist the temptation to look at yourself on screen. This looks bad, as you won't be making eye contact with the interviewer. Good luck.
And what's the questions in text, is it? Please tell us about your previous work experience.
So when I'm ready, I click I'm ready.
Yep.
And when they go into this, it's then explained to them that they won't be able to re-record their answer. They will see the question. They will have a limited time to prepare, and then they will see how much time they will have to answer that particular question.
Okay, describe a time when you needed to quickly create a good working relationship with someone. Why was it important to build the relationship? How did you do it? 20 seconds to go, 60 seconds to answer it, where you needed to quickly create a good working relationship.
So there was some research that was done in Israel looking at severity of sentencing decisions by parole boards, and what that found was that more severe sentencing decisions were being given at lunchtime. And we find exactly the same data in our platform. When we look at the scores that are given to candidates, we see that scores are typically about 20% lower at lunchtime. We see that different reviewers give consistently different scores. Some will be consistently positive, some will be consistently negative, and some will have a better range of scores. Now, that has nothing to do with video interviewing. That is to do with how we behave as humans. What recorded video interviewing does is it gives us an opportunity to actually manage this. And so where every candidate is having a completely consistent experience in terms of what they're responding to, and we can measure and monitor how reviewers are reviewing candidates, we're then able to actually provide the tools to the managers of those teams of reviewers to enable them to manage the quality of the decisions.
While much of the world is moving in the direction of standardisation of interview technique and experience, in some contexts the slightly more free-form discussion is still highly valued. The Oxbridge interview has gained a certain kind of notoriety in Britain, and what goes on behind closed doors is still pretty secret. These students from the London Academy of Excellence in East London all recently had interviews at Cambridge University.
My name is Bartek Staniszewski. I had an interview for philosophy and theology at St. Benet's in Oxford.
So tell me a little bit about how you prepared for the interview. What was the process?
I've done all sorts of preparation. At school we had workshops on Fridays on which we did all sorts of exercises. The questions that I expected them to ask, the difference between Anselm's and Descartes' ontological argument might not come up. By thinking about it and by analysing it in my head, if a different question of a similar analytic nature comes up, I'm already thinking around the right lines.
My name is Francesca Smith, and I applied for geography at Emmanuel College at Cambridge.
And what had you heard about Oxbridge interviews?
I'd heard a whole range of stuff, so some crazy things like asking someone to define every single word in an essay that they'd sent in, or asking to relate a banana to their subject, which is actually possible because I practiced it just in case.
Oxbridge secretes an awful lot of myths about itself, and that's going to be the case with institutions that are older than a lot of the others and have always had this elite cachet.
Dr. Christopher Brooke is a senior lecturer at the University of Cambridge. He's been doing admissions interviews there and at Oxford for the last 15 years. After interview, only a third of hopefuls will get a place.
I used to ask questions from a list of prepared questions that were designed to get people to think about things in quite a tightly focused way. And I do less of that these days. I tend to try to get a conversation going, beginning more informally, and see where that conversation leads. So as I get older, interviewing becomes slightly less structured than it once was. What happens in the interview conversation is you're just seeing how far they can go, how much they can do. At some point, the student will say, oh, God, I hadn't thought about that, or don't really know, or, not sure how to think about that. But the point is that these are people who've just done so much more with the material that you've given them than the others. You just want to see how much they can do with the kind of material that you've been asking people to think about. And those interviews are invigorating for the interviewers. You feel a sense that the system is working, or that it's worthwhile doing these interviews when you see people who might not be the strongest candidates on paper, but then the interview does so much to realise that these are young people who are interested in ideas, they're interested in their subject, they can see in the conversation, they can see why things are interesting and important, and you see them doing things with the material that they've been given to think about, and that is the particularly satisfying part of doing the interviews.
So, straying from the script isn't always a bad thing, especially if you're looking for free thinkers. In that case, like Ara Hanian, a senior executive at Unite Us, a software company which links patients and healthcare providers, you could throw the script and any idea of interview convention away altogether.
When it comes to the traditional interview process, I think that it's almost bordering on useless. First reason is that when an individual prepares for something, everything is focused on that particular thing they're waiting to occur. And you don't really learn a lot about a person who's been in preparation, just like you don't see who's behind the mask of a good actor. Identifying individuals who have a certain edge requires a different approach. Basically, there are 5 pillars of the interviewing approach that I have developed over years, and one of them is called the Remy test. Remy used to drive Henry Kissinger, and then he became my driver. We became very good friends. At some point during the interview, either I would make sure that they are picked up by Remy at some point, or he would drive them back to where they were going, but they would have no insight as to who he is. Some individuals automatically lose possibly respect for someone that they deemed as being less than them. Others would start talking too much. Whatever it is, it would reveal a lot about an individual. The second one was jump in a situation with me. This is when somebody comes to your office, you have a number of fires you're burning with your team. All they have to defend is their own knowledge, their confidence, their ideas. The third one is travel with me. 5-6 hours on a flight, you observe a lot of things. The fourth one is called walk with me.
The low-cost version of travel with me.
And the fifth one is called drive with me.
That's a more upmarket experience.
Occasionally, there's no flight, so you actually get in a car. And when you're driving together especially, everyone can think of having been in a car for a long period of time with someone else. And one of the things I've noticed over the years, as an individual gets more confident, they also come at peace with sometimes not having to say anything. If you're on a long stretch of road, somebody's ability to sit right there and maybe for 20 minutes at a time not say a word can say a lot about an individual. At the tail end of 4 or 5 hours, you know whether you want to see them again. When you just see them in a 45-minute interview, it's very difficult to get that sense.
The interview seems to be a constant battle between showing your true self and showing the version of yourself that the employer wants to see. Sometimes the employer might want to try a bit of fun, to get to know your funny side, and may even ask you to tell a joke or two.
A bear walks into a bar and sits down. The bartender asks, "What'll it be?" The bear says, "I'll have a gin and tonic." The bartender says, "What's with the huge paws?"
The irony, of course, is that as soon as you're told to lighten up and be yourself, there's an extensive list of guidelines about the kind of joke it's appropriate to tell at interview.
There are a few reasons why an interviewer might ask you to tell a joke in your next interview. The most likely is they're trying to throw you off a set of scripted responses. How you answer, of course, is no laughing matter. A list of rules of how to answer. 1. Keep it clean. 2. Don't be offensive. This means anything racist, sexist, ageist, religious, blonde bashing, or weight-related is probably off the table. 3. Keep it short. In fact, the shorter the better. Long jokes are hard.
I'm Catherine Carr, and you've been listening to The Y Factor. The producer was Georgina Hughes. You can listen again to this programme on the website and hear other Y Factors on subjects such as imposter syndrome, unconscious bias and exams. We'd love to hear your ideas too for future topics. Email us at yfactor@bbc.com.
Why did the Scarecrow win a Nobel Prize? He was outstanding in his field.
This week on the podcast Spark and Fire, comedian Cristela Alonzo.
I couldn't get auditions. A voice teacher told me, well, as a Latina, you can do West Side Story, and then you're done.
Cristela shares the story of being the first Latina to write, produce, and star in a primetime comedy. On Spark and Fire, creators share their stories to fuel your creativity. Spark and Fire is a Wait What original in partnership with the BBC. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts.